for. He's a consultant neurologist with Hinduja Hospital in Bombay, and he's got a special interest in epileptology. Um, he is also the co-founder of ELICIT, which stands for End of Life Care in India Task Force, and has been one of the foremost advocates for advanced care planning and appropriate end of life care in our country and abroad. He is also pioneering the field of neuropalliative care in our country, and I know he's working very hard to make that a reality here. It is not always easy to convince super specialized doctors that palliative care should be part and parcel of their practice. But when you have somebody like Dr. Roop Gursahani, who has believed in it and mentored a lot of people and continues to drive it, especially through his own specialty, it's really quite special. And so he was also part of this incredible initiative called the Lifeline Express, a train that went through different parts of rural India. And some of you might be familiar with the Lifeline Express, where they even did surgeries in the train compartments. And Dr. Roop was one of the people who volunteered his time to it. So he has a very, very strong social conscience in addition to being an extremely competent neurologist. So we're lucky to have him with us whenever he joins us. So one of the things that we will be touching upon, here he is. Hi, Roop. We were just talking about you, and I was trying not to say too many nice things about you, but it was a bit difficult. So one of the, oh, he didn't hear me. That's great. I said we were just talking about you.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, well, you're assuming it's all good stuff, but okay.
Oh, no.
No,
I'm not.
It is. So yeah, I was just giving them a bit of background on what you do and what you're passionate about and what you advocate, and the fact that we're really lucky that at the end of our FCPC session, which is our 30th, our longest standing series, with a very high attendance rate and very low attrition rate, we're glad to be closing the series with you. So I'm not going to take up any more time, and over to you, Roop.
Okay, thank you. It's always a pleasure to speak to an audience that Smriti and Pallium put together. And as Smriti told you, this is something that I am, I'm substantially invested in. Am I sharing? What is this?
You're not sharing anything yet?
Yeah, so something. Oh God. Share. Just a sec. I think
format runs. So if you have any particular questions and things, you can put it in the chat box, and from time to time, I will flag them to Roop. And I know that this is also another kind of session that can trigger a lot of strong emotions in people, which we will acknowledge. I will request that any personal shares are kept for towards the end of the session, because when someone shares something deeply moving, and if we are not able to attend to it in time, we also feel a little bad about that. So I'm sure everybody is going to have lots of different perspectives on what we talk about today. Lots of questions, I'm sure, in your minds already. So we will, like I said, we will co-facilitate and make sure that as far as possible, as many of those questions are answered. Roop, do you want to try logging out and back in again?
No. So, yeah, maybe I'll have to do that. What has happened is I upgraded my software on this, and that share thing is running into issues. So I'm just going to log out and then log in again. You're right.
Sure.
Think about your own death. And remember that for most of us, the whole issue about death and dying is basically dying with pain and suffering. So there's a very famous quip which has been attributed to Woody Allen, who apparently said, "I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens." Right? Next slide. Go on. Yeah. So I just don't want to be there when it happens. Next slide. Yeah. So when you look at well-being, or you look at quality of life. I'm not going to bother too much with this column that says quality of life has to do with well-being, which can be assessed, or quality of life, which can also be assessed, which has to do with physical health, psychological health, and all that. These are all positives. What about the negative side of the ledger? Then you look at quality of death. And then comes the question of suffering. So if you look on this side, you're looking at only positives. Here, you're looking at minimizing the negatives. And you're minimizing suffering for most people who live in countries where deprivation of basic needs no longer exists. Suffering actually tends to end up getting concentrated with serious illnesses and with the end of life. So if you look at suffering, can it be measured? Because if you can't measure it, how do you work on improving it? And the basic ideal, if you remember, of palliative care is good life till the very end. Next slide. And when people did these kind of measurements, this was pretty new when it was devised somewhere in the early 2000s. But in 2010, the Economist was commissioned by the Lien Foundation of Singapore to assess the quality of death in countries across the world. And the first time they did this survey, they looked at end-of-life care, and they did this in 40 large countries. And if you look at the arrow, you will see that India is the bottom of 40 large countries, right? So that was 2010. Go on, next slide. So in 2015, they ran it again, but this time, instead of end-of-life care, they had broadened it to incorporate all of palliative care. And then they got in more countries. The final list is almost about 67 or so. And we have improved because they found 13 countries that are worse than us. And fortunately, both China and Pakistan are worse than us. So we can be happy about that. And that is 2015 Quality of Death Index based on palliative care. Next slide. So how does it work in, say, an advanced country that does it well? And remember, the United Kingdom, although it is not the richest, although it doesn't spend the most, for many reasons, is probably the best country in the world to die in. So look at this, a 78-year-old UK citizen who's terminally ill. She can expect palliative care at home. And if required, she can be admitted to a hospice when needed so that she gets an almost pain and symptom-free death. Whatever information she wants and needs will be conveyed sensitively to her and her family with due regard to her own autonomy and whatever choices she has. Okay. The values and wishes for end-of-life care will be discussed with her doctors or trained counselors, and they will all be recorded in a way that this is actionable, that, it actually translates into action. And if she has complex problems where she may not be able to communicate, then within a week or a month before, medically it becomes impossible, you have a system called the UK Court of Protection, which is of the level of the district court and above. Often it is the High Court. And I follow the Kitzinger sisters who on Twitter, and it is amazing the way everything comes together. This is because when you are looking at complex issues of ethics, law, and medicine, you need a judge to put it together. Basically, some form of oversight. And all of this is done literally free of cost. Sorry, did something happen? Yeah. So all of this is without any charge. This is all done by public agencies. Everything is free. And the UK does substantially better than other rich countries. Next slide. What about India? Why are we not a country to die in? Though, of course, I think our government has changed that somewhat. So it's now we are dying in very fast. First is health economics. We spend very little on healthcare, and that is now something that is obvious to everybody. The role of the public sector is poor, and the private sector has no awareness of end-of-life care issues. There is government policy, but it is unimplemented. There is no public demand for palliative care. And even if there were demand, our capacity for delivering palliative care is actually quite poor. Next slide. Palliative care is not covered by insurance. Outside Kerala, whether it is palliative care or opioids, which is a marker for palliative care, quite variable. If you look at social support, psychosocial support for the family, well, if you ask for it, you will get it in the big cities, not elsewhere. And there's no policy framework for what is called shared decision making. Again, palliative care awareness and availability of volunteers, only Kerala. If you look at the press, if you look at, say, for instance, the New York Times, you'll find almost every week 2 or 3 big articles which cover these issues. In our press, minimal coverage. Next slide. So what about the professions, the medical profession, the legal profession? Well, our judges have given us some kind of framework, but the procedures that they've given are unimplementable, and I'll discuss that a little later depending on how time goes. From professional societies, yes, there is some information, but doctors are not aware of it. And you can enforce your wishes, but through consumer code, so you know how slow that is going to be. We have some policies that have been published by ICMR and AIIMS, but as I said, most doctors are not aware of that. Next slide. So as you will have seen, end-of-life care has multiple strands. It has ethics, it has legislation, it has politics, it has healthcare systems, it has complex medical decision-making, but under it all is individual human suffering, which we should never forget. Next slide. And if you look at it in terms of getting it done, whose business is it? Government, medical profession, legal profession, civil society? As you can understand, everybody's business is nobody's business. And that is the reason that today's talk is aimed at all of us as citizens. Next slide. By now, I think you know that palliative care is applicable to all serious health-related suffering. It merges into end-of-life care, which is 6 months to 1 year before the actual end of life, which often is something that you know only in retrospect. And terminal care refers to weeks to months. Eventually, people end up in the phase of actively dying, which is based on physiological parameters. And once it starts, it is irreversible. Next slide. So when we are looking at end of life and terminal care, we shift the focus of care to symptom control, comfort, dignity, quality of life, and quality of dying with support for the family, rather than treatments that are aimed at cure or prolongation. And this can begin months before death, when illness frailty is considered non-curative. Ideally, it requires home support or a hospice to take care of this. Next slide. We begin to approach this when we realize that death is unavoidable, and we shift over to symptom management, supporting the caregiver, and addressing the needs for communication of the dying person. Next slide. So I'm going to show you 2 patients along the way. Both are in the 80s. I think no, one is in his 70s and the other is in the 80s. One was a retired bureaucrat, the other is a businessman. Next slide. Yes, he's 76. Next slide. Yeah, to tell you about the trajectories of death and dying. Smriti, would this have been shown, this slide? I mean, this diagram?
No.
Okay. So this was a landmark paper that came out in the beginning of, in the early 2000s, which looked at how life ends, what are the trajectories. And as you will see, sudden death is obvious, then you have terminal illness, organ failure, frailty. I'll explain that to you. Next slide. So if you look at sudden death, you have somebody who's functioning well, doing whatever it is they're doing, and then they're hit by a truck, a bomb, a bullet, or a clot. And that's it. Obviously, there's no need for hospice or palliative care in this situation. Yeah? But you may be surprised to know that once you cross the age of 50, the likelihood of your getting this, and all of us dream of this, the likelihood of your getting this is less than 10%, maybe about 7 or 8%. Next slide. As people age into their 50s, early 60s, typically the first thing that that the first illness, major illness that has a peak is cancer. And in cancer, you know that there's a lot of treatment that is still possible, although we agree that palliative care should start right from the beginning, but often it doesn't. And it's not until the illness maybe has been through 1 or 2 rounds of chemotherapy, enters what we call the waterfall trajectory, which means that the trajectory is downwards and is not going to be arrested until death. Okay, which is where we obviously come in usually as palliative care. Next one. So this brings me to the first patient. Our gentleman had a fairly active retired life until one day in 2016, he realized he had blood in the stool. The colonoscopy picked up a cancer in the colon. And as is often the case, the gastroenterologist sent off the reports to the family physician and said, go and talk to him. Well, fair enough. Next slide. So that is the beginning of the trajectory of cancer, right? Can we go back one slide? Sorry. One more slide. Right. So you can see we are right at the beginning here, and he probably has a fairly good some period of time ahead of it. Next slide. Next one slide, and then one more. One more. Okay. What about somebody who's a little older, has either developed kidney failure or lung failure or heart failure? And this is what is called the looping trajectory. These are people who run into a crisis, go into hospital, come out, then go in again. They are never as good as they were when they went into hospital. Eventually, one of the crises, they pass away. Typically, this starts off, the peak is somewhere in the late 70s, the late 60s to early 70s. And how long this will go on is always a little unpredictable. Next slide. Sometimes you have somebody who's older and who's functioning very well, and then is hit by something which may or may not be obvious. So, for instance, you may even have something like a bad hip fracture in the elderly, and when they come out of surgery, they are never the same again. So, whether it is something that affects the brain directly or indirectly, these are people who enter a much lower level of function until they eventually pass away. Next slide. And then, of course, you have people who are very old. Usually, this applies to people in their late 70s and 80s. And at this stage, function is already down and it keeps dwindling down till death. And this applies to very elderly people, even if they don't have dementia, but especially so if they have dementia, as you will see in the next case. Next slide. So that brings me to my second patient. Now, this gentleman first began to note forgetfulness and was diagnosed early dementia. When he asked his neurologist what is going to happen, well, there was no meaningful discussion. Till then, he had an active social life, though no physical exercise. He had been working on boards of multiple companies, resigned because he had decided that he could not cope. And probably that was when he realized he had the beginning of dementia. From 14 to 17, he kept going downhill in terms of activities of daily living, ADL, but with regular annual visits to his doctor. Next slide. You know that these two gentlemen will die differently. And if you want, you can make some guesses in the chat box and we will come back to that. Next slide. Can we foresee and foretell these two patients' deaths? Well, actually we can. Not very precisely, but broadly. The problem is that as of now, when patients expect doctors to prognosticate, to tell what lies ahead, our patients are empowered. It's not like, say, a century ago where the doctor would come and say, 2 weeks more. That doesn't work. Our patients want to know honestly, they want to know accurately, and they want to have this conveyed with a sense of optimism. Not very easy. Next slide. So, Smriti, we have 5 minutes for question answers here.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Anything in the chat box till now?
No questions, but while you were talking about that catastrophic event trajectory, John had mentioned typical of present COVID-19 influenced it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, I can go on. And
Yeah.
there's another spot for. So, when you
Sorry, Roop, there's a question, but can you talk
bioethics,
about bioethics?
well, ethics will come along the way. It's part of it's embedded. I mean, uh, let's see. I mean, I'm not covering it specifically here, but we can always do that towards the end.
Yeah.
Okay, so the issue is that when you're faced with illnesses, can you recognize when they're becoming terminal? And actually, we have some ways in which we can do it. The first is the surprise question, and this actually is something that people knew a long, long time ago. And you may have heard stories of this, of an experienced doctor who walks into a party, looks at somebody, and says, "I don't think so and so has very long." And he's right. So people looked at this statistically. So when somebody, uh, an experienced clinician, and we'll discuss this a little later, uses his intuition to judge, this is 70 to 80% accurate. The second is when somebody's activities of daily living are gradually going downhill and you can see the trajectory downwards, you can project when that trajectory will bottom. Then, of course, you have people with specific illnesses. And the last is decisional. Say, for instance, if somebody has kidney failure requiring dialysis and they say, okay, no more dialysis. So that changes from disease directed therapy to comfort care. Sometimes you can combine both. Next slide. So the surprise question is, would you be surprised if this patient were to die in the next year? Or you can change the time span and make it months, weeks, days, something like that. But typically it has to be an intuitive answer, which puts together, as a clinician, as an experienced clinician, your knowledge of clinical features, comorbidities, which means all the illnesses put together, social and other factors, to get a whole picture of deterioration. As I said, with experience, people are 70 to 80% accurate on this. Next slide. What about somebody who's gradually getting less and less mobile, in bed or chair more than 50% of the day, requiring help with basic activities like toileting, bathing, eating? You can assess this systematically, but this also tells you that somebody is going down. Next slide. And you can actually put numbers to it. I won't go into this. Next slide. Now, in this, the one thing that we look at is how many illnesses does this person have? So somebody has kidney failure, but also has bad diabetes and has had a stroke. You think of this as much worse. Next slide. And if you see comorbidity, so combination of diagnosis, general physical decline. So say you get to the point that somebody required somebody else to be present when they take a bath. Disease, say somebody gets more and more breathless, can no longer walk more than a few steps with lung disease, and you know that the disease is progressing. And same thing for chronic obstructive lung disease when they start requiring oxygen. Next slide. Then, of course, you have general indicators, more than 10% weight loss in the past 6 months. Somebody who keeps getting admitted every second month, and Mr. XY is back in hospital. Or they have a sentinel event, a serious fall, like the hip fracture that I told you, or even the loss of a spouse. And we look at one particular blood test, that is the serum albumin level. So your system stops or reduces production of albumin, and that level drops. That's significant. Next slide. With diseases, you have specific guidelines, and I'll quickly run through them. Next slide. So for cancer, it's more to do with somebody who's had recurrence or metastasis, which means the disease has spread widely, and then their overall function starts to go down, which, as I've said, are both predictive. So metastatic disease and function going down. Next slide. So if you look at our gentleman, the businessman, coming back to him, he got a hemicolectomy. And he went to an oncologist. And you know what? When I spoke to him, he said, उन्होंने तो मेरे से बात ही नहीं करा, which means he didn't speak to me at all. My daughter was with me. He just looked at my daughter and spoke to her. And that is something that does happen. Eventually, he got chemotherapy, which he tolerated well. But what happened, and which the oncologist didn't know, was that the US-based grandson decided that he needed palliative care involved. And that was done. And after that, after the chemotherapy, he was following with the oncologist, except once he missed it. Next slide. So you can see in cancer how the story progresses. Go back, sorry, I should have actually finished that. So you can see how the story progresses. Things have been done, function is being maintained. There are clouds on the horizon. We know that. Next slide. What about, say, somebody who has bad lung disease? Well, repeated hospital admissions requiring oxygen and so on. I won't go into the details on this. Next slide, please. The same applies to heart disease. Again, a cardiologist should be able to say that, okay, this is a person who will probably need palliative care. Next slide. With chronic kidney disease, when somebody decides that they are not going to take dialysis, or when in spite of optimal dialysis, their symptoms are just too much. Next slide. What about neurological disease? People who have complex symptoms, who have swallowing problems, speech problems. Next slide. And you have actual indicators in specific neurological illnesses. Next slide. We won't go into the details here. Right. So we come back to our gentleman with cancer. And in November 2017, a PET CT is done after his chemo and everything. Remember, this is about a year and a half after the diagnosis, and now he has extensive metastasis. And with those metastases, the expected survival is about 4 months. And went back to the oncologist, who offered palliative chemotherapy. That's it. I mean, he didn't offer anything else. And he said that, well, again, the patient heard from his wife that the survival offered was about 8 to 10 months. Without it, about 4 months. So he would get about 4 months more. Very obviously, he chose palliative care because he had really been primed. And the hospice team began to work with him. Next slide. What about our other patient, the gentleman with the dementia? He's been toddling along reasonably well for almost about 4 years now, until suddenly in 2018, and he was walking, talking, until he got a bad bout of urinary tract infection. And as expected, although the infection had not affected the brain directly, he dropped significantly, so that he started to require support for everything, including bathing and eating also. And when the wife asked the neurologist, now what? He said, this is expected. Again, he comes in December, about 11 months later, with low sodium, again treated, and this time he is even worse. He's completely bedbound, nearly mute, and is completely dependent. Next slide. So, is anybody going to take a guess on which one of these people has a terminal illness, dementia, cancer, and why? Next slide. So when somebody is frail and with old age alone without dementia, then there are other indicators also that you can take in. They have to do with weakness, weight loss, slow walking speed. But minus dementia, typically it's a little less predictable. Next slide. But regardless of all of this, if you look at an individual and put various indicators together, you can actually score those who will not survive beyond about 3 or 4 years. So if you look at somebody who is male, say for instance, our gentleman above, needs assistance with more than up to 4 activities of daily living. Yes, he does. So that's 1 plus 1, 2, 3. Sorry, the one below that needs assistance with all activities of daily living. So 1 plus 5, that is 6. Uh, I think his serum albumin was low, so he had another 2 points on that. But anything at 6 or above, and the 1 year mortality is already over 64%. And if you look at it, if the mortality is 64% in 1 year, and that person survives that year, that subsequent year also, that so you can imagine that that individual is not going to survive beyond about 3 years. Next slide. Now, do we discuss all of this? Well, before the middle of the last century, a doctor had 3 duties: diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis, which means what will come ahead. From the time of Hippocrates, prognostication, that means foreseeing and foretelling, have been part of our responsibilities. So the thing is, from the middle of the last century, as medical treatments improved, the skill of prognosis started to decline in teaching, research, in practice. And together with that, because we were not foreseeing, we stopped foretelling, and the two of them became a vicious cycle. We stopped foreseeing and we stopped foretelling. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. So when you start to talk to somebody about end of life care, you have to actually tick off 3 boxes. The first is goals of care. This is a doctor's responsibility. So you combine this with patient education, and you talk to the patient and the family about what can be expected, what can we do. And it is not just enough to talk about treatments. When a patient says, what will happen next? What can we do? We have to talk. Ideally, you need to extend that by advanced care planning. So when a patient or a family tells you what they want, you need to document this and make it actionable. The best way to do this is to choose a proxy decision maker for the end of life, because most of us, about 70 to 80% of us, will not be able to communicate right at the end. And the third box that you tick is shared decision making. You put in the patient's or the family's values, preferences, with our own clinicians' inputs, so that you make totally appropriate decisions as time goes on. Next slide. You have to confirm a shared understanding. Do they know their prognosis? What are their fears about what is to come? And when you look ahead, what do you hope for? What would you like to do? And if the patient lacks capacity, ideally, the family should be asked, what would the patient want? Typically, when we speak to family, we get the family's views of what they want, and we have to pin them down on what the patient would have wanted. That's where you really pay attention to autonomy. Next slide. You clarify these goals, you recommend treatments that are consistent, summarize, and you revise. And once this is done, then in those of my patients where this is a routine process, this is something that keeps happening with every visit. It doesn't need to be, you don't need to spend half an hour over it. It's just a couple of sentences, as you know. Next slide. And if you do this right, then we call this advanced care planning. It has 2 components where people identify their values and preferences and put it down. That becomes a document that is called the living will. And then you appoint a surrogate decision maker or a proxy healthcare attorney. And this can be done at any stage and at any stage of illness. Ideally, it has to be done before a medical crisis or before decision-making capacity is lost. Next slide. If you do it, then the control over the last days is maintained. Of course, there are challenges. From the side of the patient, there's this fear of death and some unwillingness to talk about end-of-life care issues. From clinician side, it's basically the feeling that we don't have the time to talk about this. Or more importantly, the fact that you cannot talk about prognosis because you're not trained enough in talking about it. Next slide. So Again, uh, if you look at both of these, do you think that we can do this in India today? Is it possible? Is it legal? Is it valid? Again, chat box, and maybe you have another quick stop for question answers. Next slide. Right. So our gentleman with the dementia, uh, fourth year of illness, now badly affected. A year ago, before that, he was walking, talking, independent. Comes in with convulsions. And when he comes in, he's immediately put on the ventilator. Medications are given, seizures get controlled. And actually, he comes off the ventilator and he gets a hole put in his trachea, which is a permanent tube. And he gets a feeding tube. This second one happened with some prolonged discussion because palliative care was involved before the percutaneous endoscopic gastrostomy. And finally, he's sent home on day 28. Next slide. But when he gets home, he's completely unresponsive. He's basically in the vegetative state. And when the US-based son comes in, he says, couldn't we have involved palliative care right at the beginning? Because abroad, this is the standard. But finally, they do set up management at home. His wife is 82-year-old. They have the funds for hired caregivers. And the family physician and palliative care manage together. But he starts to develop bed sores. And finally, in March 2019, he passes away. Next slide. So when you look at somebody who reaches that kind of stage, there are specific decisions that need to be made, like feeding, IV fluids. We think of these, we don't even think about these. When we think of life-saving treatments at the end of life, we think of ventilation, we think of dialysis. No, we are looking at more basic things like feeding artificially, IV fluids, and then of course we do think of invasive ventilation and cardiopulmonary resuscitation and all that. So all of these will need to be talked about. Next slide. What about our other gentleman, whom you would have said is terminal earlier? Well, look at the way he passed away. He had a prolonged discussion with the palliative care team, with his wife. The daughter and grandson were there on Skype. Now it would be WhatsApp, of course. And the grandson actually had finished his graduation, got a new job. Because he knew how much time was left, actually took leave, said, I'm going to take care of Nana. And he went downhill. In fact, it was almost as though he waited for his daughter to arrive. And as soon as she came back, he passed away. Next slide. Now, do you understand quality of death? And how things that we do actually can make a difference? Any comments can come up in the chat box. Next slide. Yes, we have a break. Anybody? But we'll just take a very short break. For Smriti, you want to, anything that we need to quickly address?
So a lot of people have said that when you ask the question about whether the goals of care and advanced care planning are, legitimate or valid in India or possible in India, a lot of people said no. But one person said yes, possible, but not yet frequently practiced.
Yeah. Okay. So that is a good response. Goals of care is a clinician responsibility. It has nothing to do with legislation, law, anything. As you are taking care of a patient with a serious illness, your management changes from cure to care. And when that happens, goals of care have to be discussed. Advanced care planning is legally valid in India, except that the system for enforcing it is not in place. Please understand what I'm saying. The system for enforcing it is not in place. If you make a proper advanced medical directive, a living will, and you'll see the format for that, and that is a whole different topic. You are not going to get the Chief Justice of India coming running after you saying, why did you make a living will? It is illegal. Nothing. The only thing is that the system for making it enforceable is not yet in place. But think of it. If you make a proper living will, an advanced medical directive, the kind of misery it will save your family, the clarity it will give the treating team, don't you think that's important? So why do you need laws to tell you to do it? So please, I think this legal vagare, put it aside. And somebody said that the bureaucrat had better end of life care. Would you want to come back and tell me why? The bureaucrat was the one who got tubes all over the place and finally had bed sores and finally passed away. Anybody? Smriti, you want to unmute and do we tackle this or we leave it for later? So just above that, Dr. Sudha Menon said that the cancer patient had a better quality of death than Ms. Negi said the bureaucrat had. So
I think, so I think we'll have a more freewheeling conversation about that towards the end. Okay. One question that I'd like you to please take up now, Roop, is Dr. Rajni Shashikumar has asked, do we set goals of care at admission?
Goals of care is an ongoing discussion. If it's your existing long-standing patient, that is done in advance. My patients with dementia, this discussion is had when they are at home. And ideally, they don't even come to the hospital. So these are discussions that you, obviously, when you are admitting a patient, you're admitting a patient in a crisis. That's not a good time to have these discussions. They have to be had when everybody's minds are cool.
Yeah, and in palliative care, we also have something called breakpoint conversations, just to highlight that, which is at different points, different milestones in the trajectory. Someone might, the illness might deteriorate to a point where they've lost mobility or they've lost another function, or, a report has come back,
metastasis,
which is not, where there's metastasis, or whether there's, there was hope for improvement, but maybe the second line drugs have failed. So those kind of milestone, those are the breakpoint conversations that we have, where we revisit the goals of care and say, okay, now we have this information. Now has anything changed in what you want? I mean, I'm trivializing and paraphrasing that conversation, but like Dr. Roop said, that we revisit this conversation right through the trajectory. Yeah.
Sure, let's go on.
Yeah.
Right. So if you look at somebody who has terminal illness, and if you were to look at the gentleman with the dementia, I would have called him terminally ill when he maybe at the beginning of the last year, when he lost mobility and was completely bedridden. Except that in dementia, you can't put down a figure of 6 months or 12 months. You would say that he has a likelihood of passing away, a better than 70% likelihood of passing away within the next 1 year. So, as I said earlier, next slide, we'll go on. We've already covered this. Next slide, we'll drop this because, okay. So then you have somebody who enters the phase of active dying. Now, these are the hours or days preceding death, during which time the patient's physiological functions wane. There's less urine output, less eating, they become less conscious, and you have to prepare the family and caregivers for the natural process of dying. And the treatment here changes to multidisciplinary and holistic. You're looking at everything together. Next slide. I'd like you to think of the death of somebody close to you and see if you can figure out if you could identify a period of active dying. Next slide. Next slide. I think I've repeated slides here. Yeah. So this is another patient. Now, this patient is different from the other two. In fact, she did not have what you would have called a terminal illness. Why? Well, she's 79. She had bad diabetes. She was on insulin. But she was completely independent. In between June and August of 2017, she developed multiple skin abscesses. She had to be admitted twice. So remember that marker I told you, recurrent admissions. And finally, the infectious physician said, no more antibiotics. We will just do daily dressings and pain control. What does this mean? That curative treatment has effectively stopped. And a month later, she starts to go downhill. Her activity is reduced. She's in bed most of the time. She needs help, bathing, toileting, dressing, except feeding. But then the appetite starts to go down. Intake of food and water goes down. And in the second week of November, she starts to become confused, a little restless. Even when we turned her over, she had pain. A little earlier, when we had talked to her about pain relief, she had very clearly said, no, I don't want pain relief. This was when she was being treated. She was a very stoic woman, but now she was visibly in pain, and we did what we could. Her hands and feet became cold. She became incontinent. And 3 days later, uh, literally, while her son was holding her hand, she stopped speaking and she stopped breathing. Next slide. So this actually can be any patient. Next slide. When you say incurable illness, we think of cancer, heart, lung failure, old age, but it can also be something like diabetes. Next slide. And if you realize the approaching death triggers have been clicked by general indicators decline and the change of focus from disease-directed therapy. Next slide. Terminal illness, well, unfortunately here we recognize terminal illness in retrospect, meaning, of course, we realized it when she was actively dying, but before that, we always thought that she would pull through. But repeated admissions, needing daily care, increasing burden of symptoms. Next slide. And when this happens, our important job is to talk to the patient and the caregivers. How much do they understand? How much do they want to know? She was very clear. She didn't want to know too much details, but she wanted to know what about the antibiotics. We told her that no, antibiotics are no longer working on you. No medicines are working on you. We asked her whether she would want to go back to hospital and try again. She said no, whatever happens, at home. And she didn't want to know about time or anything like that. Next slide. So pre-active dying was when she actually stopped moving around and started to take to bed, needing activities, help with all basic activities. Next slide. And when this happens, remember, the body is shutting down. Intake is going down. Families get very worked up. They talk about kuch kha rahi hai, kuch pee nahi rahi hai. I remember with her, she would, when her appetite went down, she would ask for all kinds of odd things. And then her son would run around trying to get it for her, and then she would take just one morsel and stop. Her fluid requirements, she would take only about a liter. And this is true because the body is shutting down, the requirement of fluid goes down. If that also oral feeds are not possible, you can give it subcutaneously. We do not put in Ryle's tube at this stage because it is very uncomfortable and it doesn't reduce the risk of aspiration. People can get overloaded with fluid. Again, no intravenous fluids. And what you do is called hand feeding. With that, aspiration risk is generally manageable. Next slide. You have to check for pain. This lady whom I was involved with was very clear she did not want, she would take a Crocin once in a while, but that was it. If she had gotten breathless, we would have done things like fanning the face, maybe tried a small dose of morphine or lorazepam, but no oxygen. And right at the end, she became anxious. I mean, she became restless and confused. But earlier, if it had happened, one would have had to look for causes like pain, check the bladder, and if need be, use medications to calm her down. We do not use physical restraints. We don't never tie patients down. If at all, it is medical. Next slide. And at this stage, you stop all medicines that are not required for symptom control. Those that are required for symptom control, if need be, you can give them subcutaneously. There's a whole pharmacopoeia that is used in this regard, and it works. Next. Towards the end, noisy secretions, because of collected secretions at the back of the throat, do not cause discomfort to the patient, but relatives get very worked up. You have to explain to them that it is not causing distress. If at all, you put the patient in a semi-prone position so that the mouth is downward and this can come out. If at all, you may need to remove the secretion from the angle of the mouth using a finger and a gauze. And you can use medications which dry the secretions up. Next slide. What about the last, which is usually just stops breathing and the heart stops. But there are two dramatic events that families need to be prepared for. People can get epileptic seizures. This is very typical in neuro cases. They have to be told, the family has to be told not to do anything, do not force objects into the mouth. Typically, we use subcutaneous medications, both midazolam and anti-epileptic drugs. And the family, literally, we have to handhold them through this because the patient will gradually become unconscious, quiet, will stop moving. Typically, at this stage, there is activity going on inside the brain because the brain is the last thing to fall, to stop. That and the heart. And that's when everything stops. The other dramatic event that occurs is in head and neck cancer. That's called a blowout hemorrhage. This is because the cancer infiltrates the arteries of the neck, and literally, at some point they bleed to death. Now, this is not something that when we call it a blowout hemorrhage, but it doesn't mean that there's a fountain of blood, though I've heard of that also happening. Typically, it starts to ooze, and then the ooze becomes more and more, and there's blood all over the place. And you need to prepare. The caregivers have to be warned. So you use pressure, you use dark colored towels so that the blood doesn't show, and you quickly sedate the patient. As and when this starts, this is a palliative care emergency, and whoever is there in the palliative care team available usually will be there at the bedside to handle this. Next slide. Remember that throughout this process, the family may be suffering as much and maybe even more than the patient. And you have to address their social, spiritual, religious needs. So as you begin discussing this, you need to talk to them about where the death certificate will come from. So the doctor will need to be involved there. Do they have any people want to put Ganga Jal and so on? That's okay. That's what they have to do. Next slide. This period of active dying lasts 1 to 3 days. Maximum is 1 week. You realize it by change in breathing, reduced consciousness, increasing pain, cold hands and feet. And you can actually tell them that this is not going to last very long now. And as I said with my patient, she was gone 3 days later after this started. Next slide. And when one is a professional dealing with this, you need to confirm death at home. You obviously confirm identity, watch for signs of life, response, feel for pulse, and then go ahead with the documentation. Next slide. Bereavement is important. Typically in palliative care, and Smriti will explain it to you, the family needs support. You need to explain to them that grief will come in waves. It will come and it will go. It will come and it will go. Normal grief lasts up to 6 months. Complicated grief, which verges into depression, may need medical help. And that's something that you need to warn them for and be watching out for. Because you don't want more casualties. Next slide. So the key illnesses are that terminal illnesses can be identified. We have to shift the focus to symptom control, comfort, and quality of life for the patient and family. The active dying phase must be recognized and the family must be prepared. And family support begins before death and continues afterwards. Next slide. I'm not sure. Okay. I'm going to stop here for questions, and then depending on time, then we might, there's a small bit more which might be important to you, but we'll figure that out towards the end. There's one little part that I do want to discuss with you right at the end. So can we just open up discussion?
Yeah, sure. Let's do that.
And sorry, I'll just interrupt. Can you uh, go to, you can stop sharing, but go to uh, slide 112. Yeah, stop sharing. We'll put it on when we start speaking again. There's just about 5-7 minutes left, but there's a slightly different issue. Yeah.
So I'm just going to backtrack a little bit, Roop. There's
Yeah. Somebody's
yeah.
right.
So there's one question I think, which is, I mean, okay, I'm just going to go back to the advanced care planning bit, and we've talked about the fact that in India, well, the procedure is quite difficult, etc. One thing I want to highlight is just the act of having that conversation itself is really important. Whether you get it registered or whether you are able to invoke it later, the fact that you can sit down with your family and have that conversation in and of itself is very clarifying for the family. So that's one thing. The second thing is that Rajni has brought up an important question about what happens when a patient has dementia, and in the goals of care discussions and stuff. Then is it the closest person who decides for them?
Okay, so when the person has dementia, now that is where ethics really come in. So ideally, if we are aware of it, the beginning of loss of memory is the beginning of diagnosis of dementia, and we should be able to uh, identify it. And that's the time to have this conversation, because if you miss that, maybe that 1 or 2 years where the person has insight and can make decisions, then you lost it for good. And then after that, well, 10 years later is when you surface. Ideally, uh, with, and I can share case stories of people who managed to keep control even after the onset of dementia, because they put the mechanisms in place. Otherwise, yes, other people, the family has to decide for them. Yeah, then the next one was Prasanna. Yeah, and the family keeps running, quite right. Sorry.
Mostly these are mostly comments.
Okay.
But we have about 17 minutes. So if there's anything anyone wants to ask before we move on to the last section, or what do you want to do?
Parul wanted to say something about care is equally expensive. Is that actually, you know what? Cure can be expensive. Care is never expensive. Palliative care is the least expensive of the palliative medicine is the least expensive of the specialties. So
you're on mute, Parul. If you're speaking, we can't hear you.
Yeah. Doctor, I just wanted to mention about, because as caretakers whom at home many times they hire,
right.
those charges are, not everyone can afford.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So I have a slightly different perspective on that. If you look at organizing the care of somebody with dementia in the United States, for instance, you're looking at somewhere between $60,000 and $100,000 per year. In India, I would put it this way, that a middle or upper middle class person can be well taken care of at home. Depending on how much the family can spend time. But my feeling is that net the cost will not cross 1 lakh. 1 lakh is the outer limit, but about 50,000, and you can take very good care of somebody. 50,000 a month, sorry, it's not a small sum, but about 6 lakhs a year is, I think you can take very good care. Now, for middle to upper middle, it's not, I mean, obviously, it's not a small burden, but it's doable. The problem is that it's not organized.
Yes.
Can we go on?
Hi, Dr. Roop. This is
Hi.
Dr. Sudha from Bangalore. The biggest stumbling block I feel are doctors themselves. So when we are
Absolutely.
managing terminal patients, I'm very sorry to say that, because yes, as a
I agree.
physician, yeah, I find myself almost like a near extinct species, because I'm only trying to tie the loose ends, you know. So how do we change that? Because we are not taught about death and dying in medical college. We're not taught. All what we pick up is as we, kind of stumble along and see patients on a regular basis. But doctors are not willing to talk about death and dying to patients. And
Okay.
oncologists are also to blame. I find that very, very odd. The concept of palliative care is never talked about. And
Yeah.
it's
So
such a huge stress, if you really look at it. I mean, I must say, Smriti, this compliment goes to you and your team. It's opened my eyes out tremendously. So from preventive medicine, I've just jumped to palliative care, and I've taken it, like a fish to water, because such a deficiency in our day-to-day practice.
yes.
I just want to know how we can overcome that block.
So I think we'll come back to that towards the end. but
All right,
I think
will do.
I think the most important thing is for all of us to advocate for it. All
Yes.
of us start with our families, look at the circles around us, go on to wider and wider circles. Never miss the opportunity for for showing the flag.
Yeah, I've started doing it.
We'll go on to the rest of the presentation, because there's some things that you will I think will yes. So I've been involved in this since 2011. That's a much younger me, obviously. This was the Aruna Shanbag case. I was part of the medical team that commented on her. And then after that, it became, I was drawn in. Next slide. So my main focus currently in advocacy has been advanced care planning. Living wills, advanced medical directives, and advanced care planning. I've already told you that's a process that can start off at any age or stage. And basically, it's about understanding and sharing personal values, life goals, and so on. Next slide. For many people, this would involve choosing and preparing another trusted person to make medical decisions when the person can no longer make his or her own. That is the most crucial part of it. So whether it is one, two, or three, typically we ask for three people to be named in sequence. They don't work like a committee, but depending on who's available. So the one who's most likely and most first, it comes first, and so on. Next slide. And this is combined with a document. This document is up on the Pallium website. Next slide. Where you specify the situations in which you would not want to have various treatments. And these treatments include IV fluids, artificial feeding, dialysis, and so on. You can tick them or put down other wishes also. And these are the specific situations in which you would want this to be applied. Next slide. To secure compliance with this declaration and to make medical decisions, I hereby appoint the following. Now you can actually cross out to make medical decisions. So that it could also be that the medical power of attorney only has the job of making sure that your wishes are followed. But typically, because it's not possible to predict what all can happen, you do prefer to leave medical decision making to that power of attorney. Next slide. The thing about this living will, it's called the living will because it comes into effect when you're still living, as opposed to the estate will, which comes into effect only after the individual has died. This can be revoked orally at any time. And if I were to see this living will, and the patient was awake and able to talk to me, my first priority is to ask him, this is your living will. Do you still stand by it? Next slide. As I said, this is available at multiple sites. Vidhi Legal Policy, Vidhi is this think tank in Delhi, which has been working with us. And in fact, we've actually drafted a whole end of life care legislation, which we hope some sensible state government will take up. Because I do not think the central government, at least not this government, will be able to take it up. Next slide. This all follows on from the judgment that came out in 2018. This is called the Common Cause versus Union of India. And it recognized that the right to refuse medical treatment had its basis in the rights to autonomy, dignity, and privacy. Remember that when we became independent, liberty was granted. I mean, was what we wrote in our software manual. But that liberty was a kind of a broad political liberty. It did not really come into our personal space. It was only with these three judgments that came out in 17 and 18. The privacy judgment, the same-sex judgment, and this common cause judgment on healthcare, where liberty finally became an individual personal liberty. And this judgment particularly provided constitutional basis for advanced medical directives or living wills, as also for withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment. And this judgment prescribed procedures, including safeguards and guidelines. Next slide. And the problem was the safeguards and guidelines that they put in. Now, you have to understand that they are judges. They are setting constitutional directions. They don't want to do things that have to be discussed in parliament and framed in parliament. So they just made this broad omnibus kind of a declaration that living wills were valid. But they did not want to keep it completely open. So they put down criteria and they required that the living will needed to be signed before a judicial magistrate first class, preserved in a district court. Unfortunately, the mechanism for doing this is now exactly 3 years, more than 3 years, 3 years and 2 months since this judgment was passed. No orders have been passed to subordinate courts. So if you write your living will in the format that is up there on the Pallium India website and take it to your nearest, your friendly neighborhood judicial magistrate first class, if he or she is willing to see you or talk to you, what you will be told by that worthy is that, sorry, I have no knowledge about this and I'm not going to touch it. So that is the problem, that this judgment is not a law. And it is important for it to become law passed either by states or by the center, because it is only laws that can say thou shalt not, on pain of. The poor judges can't do that. They've done as much as they could. Now it's up to us to push the politicians to do this. Remember that in the United States, the whole living will thing began as a citizens' movement. And as it moved on, because state by state politicians realized that this was something that citizens were concerned about, and there became a competition to see which state had the better one. And so now the United States is the world's laboratory and it has the best system for all of this. Next slide. Well, after this judgment was passed, we have this one newspaper article where this gentleman and his wife went and made their advanced directives. Guess how he did it? He himself happens to be a professor of law. So I'm sure the district judge must have been a student or something. So the district judge passed an order and finally the judicial magistrate first class signed off on his living will. Next slide. The worry that our legal system has is that these will get misused. Now, the world's authority on this is a guy called Thaddeus Pope, and he says that in the US, well, they are overwhelmingly safe. You cannot have 0% risk. Out of 40 years experience with 2.5 million deaths which are covered, there's only been 10 or 20 documented cases of abuse. So what are we worried about? Why can't we just allow them for use? Next slide. Now, how do you go ahead and use it? You have to begin by speaking to those close to you. Choose your surrogate. And when you choose your surrogate, confirm that they accept the responsibility, understand your wishes, and will follow them. And you decide whether they can have any discretion or not. People have to understand your wishes. There are some, you'll have somebody who'll say, you signed, no, I'll sign it. I'll sign you out whenever the time comes. And somebody else will say, no, papa, no, mummy, how can I ever sign on it? I will never let you go. neither of these two are acceptable. You want somebody who will listen to you and understand your wishes. When you do this, remember to have it signed in front of two witnesses. And as I said, since I'm speaking publicly, my advice to you is to try and get this signature in the presence of and attested by a judicial magistrate first class. And all the best of luck to you if you can get it. But making it and signing it in front of two witnesses, well, it's not illegal. It's absolutely not illegal. Next slide. And once you make it, please show it to every doctor you consult. You will find out if the doctor is willing to accept it and support you. The doctor will find out if their hospital's policy will allow it, so that you know where to get admitted in emergency, and the doctor will know your wishes. Next slide. Next slide, we'll leave this. Unfortunately, we still don't know of anybody who has done the whole process and has actually worked it through. Next slide. Our group, we formed a group which took this up sometime just before the pandemic broke. The Supreme Court had asked the Union Ministry of Health to follow up on this. Obviously, as you can imagine, nothing has happened. Next slide. But if you look at it from the Indian Association of Palliative Care and the Indian Society of Critical Care Medicine, on the doctor's side, not all doctors, but some doctors have put together the basic processes for doing all of this. Next slide. And some part of this we follow at Hinduja Hospital. It's followed at AIIMS. It's followed in Manipal. Next slide. Manipal at KMC at Karnataka. In the rest of the world, if you do this right, you will end up with these luridly colored forms. And these luridly colored forms, which are properly filled in, signed, and are valid, are put up all over the place. Next slide. Guess where they put up? They are put up in the home. In American homes, you will see them stuck to the fridge, because if somebody sees an individual lying unconscious, they break into the house, the first thing they look at is the fridge to see if there's a document there. Next slide. The All India Institute has put out clear-cut guidelines for its doctors, and there is a fair amount of discussion there, and these are now being used. And for us, since that is a government body, that is effectively the final document that we all prefer to follow. Next slide. There are forms there and so on. Next slide, go on. So if anybody tells you it's illegal, here. Now, if you look at all of this, you will have doctors who will say, how can you compel me to do this? Do we have a law? If we don't have a law, this is illegal. I've had this argument today morning. Now, I prefer to look at it as a glass that is half full, because I am an optimist. Of course, you can have various ways of looking at glasses that are half full. We'll leave that aside. Next slide. Why does the medical profession shy away? Well, if you are a patient, you will think that this is because of perverse incentives. And that the argument that I had today morning, well, on the other side, I had an argument with a doctor, and I had a bit of an argument with the family, because I was telling them that it's a little difficult for me to complete these formalities. And the family said, you're going to make money out of keeping my mother on the ventilator. So partly this is a problem in corporate hospitals, where people believe that corporate hospitals are those where the poor cannot enter and the rich cannot leave, which actually is true. But that is not because people like keeping patients in the ICUs. Remember that when somebody lands up and occupies an ICU bed, they generate revenue only in the first 5 to 7 days. After that, frankly, it's a waste of ICU space. The most important problem is the lack of legal clarity. And doctors are worried about criminal charges and litigation. So it's like almost like urban legend. Whenever you do this, everybody will tell you, what if the fifth son comes from the US and says that you killed my mother together with my eldest brother? Then, of course, we've already spoken about the difficulties in establishing prognosis. But the most important is the lack of capacity. Nobody is trained in palliative care or on end-of-life care or on communication skills. Next slide. So this is the group that I am part of. This is from intensivists, neurologists, and palliative care specialists. And well, we've been working. We thought we would be done by this time, but as you can see, we are nowhere close to it. Next slide. There's a lot of clarity now. Unfortunately, doctors are not aware of this. Next slide. But sorry, just hold on. Go back. Remember that this whole process is actually decriminalized. So earlier, there was this worry that if you took these decisions for doctors, there was a worry that you would be hauled up for murder. After the Aruna Shanbag case, that is over. It will be civil liability or consumer court liability. But what I tell my colleagues is that doing right can never be illegal. You have to follow due process and you have to document completely. Next slide. And in the rest of the world, even in India, actually litigation is the other way around. That if we keep patients beyond the time that they should be there, we will actually be sued for that. Next slide. So I'm going to end with this. What is a good death and why is it difficult in India? A good death begins with knowledge. Knowledge means prognosis, which is delivered with honesty, accuracy, and optimism. The patient accepts this, passes the Kubler-Ross stages of acceptance, and completes their life review. It's like you kind of settle your emotional debts. You close your emotional accounts. And this requires both palliative care, counseling services, and doctors who have training in communication skills. Next. The next issue is autonomy. Constitutionally and legally, this is valid. We can write advanced medical directives, but unfortunately, the Supreme Court procedure is not possible for lay. Appointing a healthcare power of attorney is valid and possible. Application of the medical directive is valid, but if you follow the Supreme Court procedure, there is a barrier, but there are ways that we can tackle it. What you can do is withhold. So rather than take somebody off a ventilator, if it is discussed in advance, you can avoid putting them on a ventilator, and that is completely valid and legal. Next slide. But the most important point is you need palliative care to make this all possible. You need palliative care to assess and control symptoms, to support the family, to manage spiritual distress, and to manage the bereavement that comes after it all. Next slide. And until that happens, well, we will all have to do our best with whatever little we have. Thank you so much. This is my, go back. This is my email ID and my mobile number. I wouldn't recommend you to call me up, but emails are always welcome. And I think we should be able to put up these slides, give them out as a PDF.
Yeah, we send them out as learning material.
Okay, I will do that.
Thank you. Manisha, you can stop sharing, I think.
Yeah, open up the discussion.
All right. We are actually past time, but if everybody's okay to stay on for 5 minutes, I think we might have a few questions that we can take. Very rich session, Roop. Thank you. So if anyone has any specific burning question, please go ahead and ask it. Just to be mind. I've put up links on the chat. One is to the advanced directives, the document. One is a commentary on the Supreme Court directive, and the third is the ICMR guidelines, Roop, that talk about what a doctor can and cannot do.
Yeah. So there's just one question, and that is the caregiver service available for. The problem is that you can, but the problem with caregivers, I actually use slightly different terminology here. I call care partners. Care partner is usually a family member, but may not be related also. Somebody who takes care of the patient and the patient is still involved. Caregiver is a family caregiver. And then caretaker is the paid caretaker. So I kind of distinguish these three entity. So what you are talking about is a paid caretaker. The service is by international standards dirt cheap. Unfortunately, it is not standardized. This is one of the things that we are trying to look at, but getting traction, at least during this pandemic, is difficult. If we can get this as something that is taught as a skill, you will realize that we will not only get standardization, and it also should not be that expensive. Right.
Okay. So I don't want to keep anyone here too late. Any closing comments, Roop?
No, thanks. It was great. I didn't know I was and I was doing the honors effectively.
No. I just want no. We'll close the session.
I would really have been very much more stressed. Fortunately, I didn't know it.
No. Okay, so then I'll save you the stress. So thank you. I think that brings us to the end of a very, very, very enriching 30 sessions. And I'm sure Roop's presentation has opened up many